Commissioner O'Donnell, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Vice President Fielder?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Time is now 1:32 p.m. on Tuesday, August 8th, 2023. I call this meeting of the Montana Public Service Commission to order. We are in the commission conference room of the Montana PSC. Would my colleagues join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you, colleagues. I would note for the record that Commissioner Pinocci, myself, and Commissioner Bukacek are present in the Bollinger Room here at the PSC, and Commissioner O'Donnell and Vice President Fielder are participating online. So we do have quorum. Just a technical matter. I am informed that we do not have video feed for this meeting, correct? So we apologize for those that may be tuning in that you can't see us, but you should be able to follow along with the proceedings verbally. All right. Montana Public Service Commission welcomes public comment on any matter that is on today's agenda or on any matter that's within the jurisdiction of the Montana PSC. Are there any public commenters in the room? Any public commenters in the room? Seeing none, are there any public commenters online? I'm informed there are not, so no public comment this afternoon. So there are no changes to the agenda today, so let's move right into our action items. Action item number 1 is approval of the commission minutes for the week of July 31st, 2023. Is there a motion?
Thank you, Mr. President. I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
A second.
Commissioner Bukacek has seconded. We have motion and second. Are there discussion on the minutes, changes, revisions as drafted? Seeing none, all those in favor of Commissioner Pinocci's motion to approve the commission minutes for the week of July 31st, 2023, signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. Seeing no opposition, minutes are approved unanimously. All right, let's move into the one work session item that we have today. This is docket 2022.11.099. This is Montana Dakota Utilities. This is MDU's rate case. Commission is here to consider staff recommendations concerning the settlement proposal in MDU's rate case and to act on the same. Ms. Umstead?
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good morning or good afternoon, President Brown, commissioners. Just to take you through a timeline of the docket before you, on November 4th, 2022, Montana Dakota filed an application with the commission to increase electric rates. In the application, Montana Dakota requested an electric revenue increase of approximately $10.5 million based on a return on equity of 10.5% and an overall rate of return of 7.525%. This proposal would increase typical residential customer rates by 19.1%, or an average increase of $16.96 per month based on typical residential customer usage. On January 25th, the commission issued an interim order authorizing Montana Dakota to temporarily increase electric revenue by $1.7 million for a typical residential customer using 792 kilowatt hours per month. This resulted in an increase of $2.33 per month, or approximately 2.6%. The only parties to intervene were the Montana Consumer Council and Denbury Onshore LLC. In Discovery, Montana Dakota filed an updated revenue requirement increase based on the closure of the Sydney Sugars plant, and this resulted MDU's request to increase by approximately $1 million for an overall requested revenue requirement increase of approximately $11.5 million. On April 7th, 2023, the Montana Consumer Council submitted intervenor testimony supporting a revenue requirement increase of approximately $4.7 million with an ROE of 9.1% and an overall rate of return of 6.821%. Denbury submitted intervenor testimony supporting a revenue requirement increase of approximately $3.8 million, utilizing the same return on equity and rate of return as the MCC. On May 19th, however, MCC submitted cross-intervenor testimony and updated their recommended revenue requirement increase to $3.5 million approximately. And that brings us to June 12th of 2023. The commission received a stipulation between all of the parties. The parties agreed to resolve all issues, and the stipulated revenue requirement would result in an increase of approximately $6.1 million and a return on equity of 9.65%. The stipulation calls for an overall rate increase of 9.1%, but specifically the residential customer class would see a 9.11% increase. The bill impact from the stipulation for a typical residential customer, again using 792 kilowatt hours per month, would see an increase of approximately $8 or $96.09 per year. From interim rates currently in effect, the stipulation would result in approximately 6.5% increase to residential rates. And with that overview of the original positions and the timeline, I will hand it over to Grant for staff's analysis.
Thank you, Brooke. Good afternoon, commissioners. Generally speaking, authorized rates should permit a public utility to earn enough revenue to fund prudent operations, pay taxes and fees, recoup prudent investment in capital assets, and provide a reasonable return on those capital investments. The return must be sufficient to pay the interest on outstanding debt and provide a fair return on equity investors, referred to as the return on equity or ROE. There are a few general regulatory principles that guide the analysis of revenue requirement staff when we formulate a recommendation for the commission's consideration. First is the concept of the regulatory compact. In general, that compact is a trade-off. A utility will be given the opportunity to earn a fair rate of return on its investment and will be protected from competition. In return, the utility will provide safe, reliable service to all customers that require service at just and reasonable prices. The return is measured to shareholders or the return on equity. What constitutes a fair ROE? There are two seminal U.S. Supreme Court decisions which guide the Commission's return on equity decisions. FPC versus Hope Natural Gas and Bluefield Waterworks versus West Virginia Public Service Commission. Those two decisions set three basic standards for determining a fair rate of return. To paraphrase, those standards are that a utility's ROE should be commensurate with other businesses of similar risk. The ROE should be sufficient to maintain the financial integrity of the company, and the ROE should be adequate such that utility can attract investors and capital on reasonable terms. To summarize, the regulatory compact and Hope and Bluefield decisions covers what we as staff believes the responsibilities of the commissions are regarding public utilities it regulates and the standards and principles that guide staff. Staff prepared a memorandum which was circulated to the commission on July 26 and should all be before you today. The memorandum provides a summary of the application, intervener's position, stipulation, and staff's analysis and recommendation. As Brooke mentioned, the stipulation would result in a revenue increase of $6.1 million and an ROE of 9.65%. The stipulation further detailed components of the revenue requirement increase and revenue requirement allocation and rate design. Overall, staff conducted an independent analysis of the record evidence to find a range of reasonableness amongst the parties' positions. The low end of this range constitutes a $4.9 million revenue increase and an ROE of 9.44%. The low end of this range, the high end of this range constitutes a 9.3 million revenue increase and ROE of 10.1%. The stipulated revenue increase and ROE falls within the range of reasonableness. Staff notes that within the stipulation, all parties made significant concessions. And while staff does not agree or disagree with the components of the revenue requirement presented in the stipulation, staff finds the stipulation as a whole is reasonable. It allows Montana Dakota a reasonable opportunity to recover its prudently incurred cost. Staff recommends approval of the stipulation, and with me today are Lucas, Brooke, Haley, and Tim, and we're available for any questions. Thank you, Commissioners.
Haley, anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just note that the cost allocation and rate design are reasonable in the context of the stipulation, and those outcomes are most in line with the MCC's original recommendations in this docket. The stipulation also includes no increase on the basic service charge for the residential customer classes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hamilton, anything to offer?
I have nothing to add, Mr. President.
Okay. Thank you, staff. Appreciate your hard work on this. All right, I will move to approve the MDU stipulation as filed. Is there a second?
I second.
Commissioner Bukacek has seconded. Discussion.
Mr. President,
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I yield at this time to the people, those of you who made the motion.
I'm sorry, Commissioner O'Donnell, we'll have a little trouble hearing you.
Oh, thank you. No, I was saying that the people who made yourself and Commissioner Bukacek, who made and seconded the motion, should have the privilege of going first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Is there discussion? Mr. Bukacek?
Yes, I prepared some remarks for today, with your indulgence, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
So consumers asking us to reject the settlement before us come in three basic categories, all perfectly understandable. One, probably the most common, most correspondents conveyed sincerely heartfelt words about difficulty paying their bills, difficulty making ends meet. And I want to make it real clear to the public that all 5 commissioners care deeply about the individual ratepayers in their districts and in all of Montana. Understand, we're talking about an $8 a month increase for a product that's essential for life. It's less than the cost of many non-essentials commonly undertaken, such as one Saturday matinee movie without popcorn, the cost of 2 latte grandies. It's also that $8 is less than the cost of a quality burger and fries. Now, President Brown might muster a compelling case that latte grandies are an essential part of life, but I don't think he could make that for Saturday matinees or burger and fries. Agreed? So that would be probably the most common complaint. And I just think it's important to have that perspective of what we're talking about here, and that we do spend money on non-essentials every month. Number 2, other ratepayers would state if we must increase the rates, increase it to the minimum that allows the company to stay functioning. They stay, understandably, if MDU is willing to go from 19% to 9% roughly, they must have been asking, too much to start with. Now, I think most of us have negotiated something in our lives, maybe buying or selling a house or a car or a pet, maybe dickering at a market. It would be foolish for a seller to lowball against their own interests. On the other hand, as consumer advocate, it's the MCC's job to make an offer as low as possible within their parameters. In this case, despite these 2 different foci, they were able to come to an agreement within the range of what is legal and reasonable. Negotiation is a part of adult life, and we seldom get exactly what we want. Number 3, and this is going to be a little bit time consuming. Other letter writers talk about monopolies as though monopolies are intrinsically evil and motivated only by corporate greed and excessive profits. Such correspondence tells me that these folks don't understand why we have power monopolies. So I'll be brief here, but due to the high cost of building and maintaining the grid, electricity transmission and distribution can only be done by companies with investors willing to invest millions of dollars without a guarantee of a rate of return. It's reasonable to assume that such investors are more likely to invest if they are not facing a hostile regulatory environment. So the deal that has been struck is energy utilities are granted monopoly control over a local market and then mandated by the government to provide affordable, reliable energy, a reasonable level of service at a fair price. Our job at the Public Service Commission, our job is to enforce that mandate. That's in response to the letters.
Additional discussion?
Mr. President, I have a couple of comments here.
Sure, Vice President Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I feel with this rate case, the requested increase that the commission has been placed between a rock and a hard place. I absolutely do not want to approve a rate increase. Prices on so many things have been going up over these last 2 to 3 years. It's been difficult for a lot of people. However, by law, utility companies are entitled to recover the costs for delivering and providing the service and a reasonable rate of return on the risk of their investment. I've analyzed this case, and I agree with staff that this settlement agreement falls on the lowest cost end of the range of reasonableness. It cuts Montana Dakota Utilities' initial request by more than half. And I feel that if the commission were not to approve this settlement agreement, we are not likely to achieve lowering the costs any further. In fact, it may actually result in costing ratepayers more money due to the lengthy process that would ensue if we do not concur in this settlement agreement that was reached between all of the parties involved in the case. So for that reason, Mr. President, I reluctantly will be voting yes. I think we found probably the best that we can do. Although it is an increase, it is a much smaller price increase than the company had requested.
Thank you, Vice President Fielder. Additional discussion?
Mr. President.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. Excuse me for if I'm a little halting right here. I'm trying to read what I wrote, and I just had cataract surgery 2 weeks ago, so it's a little difficult for me. So if I make some errors and have to go back again to correct myself, I apologize. But so with great and due respect to my colleagues and commission staff, I will have to vote no on this motion. Specifically, I'm concerned with paragraph 8E of the stipulation, in which the parties agreed to a $1.2 million revenue requirement attributed to the retired coal plant deferrals. Notably, the parties did not agree to a total balance of retired coal plant deferrals that would be paid by customers, the amortization period for collecting that balance, or the carrying costs associated with that balance. I'm not totally persuaded by MDU's assertions that the decision to retire the Sydney coal plant, was reasonable and prudent when it was made. But in particular, I'm concerned that this commission, in a prior MDU rate case, approved a significant investment in those assets, the Sydney plant, on the understanding that the investment would extend the useful life for a certain period of time. That understanding was material to the commission's decision to allow substantial rate recovery. Instead, MDU independently and unilaterally decided to retire these facilities years in advance, between 2 and 3 years of what was promised. I'm not persuaded that the retirement of those plants would lead to cost savings for MDU customers, and as MDU has asserted. I do understand that the interveners in this case, Denbury and the Montana Consumer Council, started from their position that some of the costs of those retired coal assets should be recovered from ratepayers. but I still have questions about the prudency of that decision. And I believe all of the settling parties need to do a better job of explaining why they believe the retirement decision was prudent, which is a necessary precursor to attributing this $1.2 million in annual revenue to the retired coal plant deferrals. Accordingly, I believe the best course of action is to reject the settlement and proceed to a hearing. For these reasons, I am an adamant no on this motion. But I would also mention I really do appreciate the thoughtfulness of other commissioners on this. And I agree with staff's recommendation that this stipulation is reasonable. I also feel that we can do better for NDU ratepayers. It seems quite clear to me that our job is not to make decisions that are in the realm of range of reasonableness, but the lowest of the reasonable, thus protecting ratepayers from overpaying. In regard to the issue that was raised about negotiations, I really believe that the parties in this case are in no position to negotiate anything. They are not negotiating an agreement with themselves, between themselves, as private parties would do. But the Public Service Commission, we are the deciding factor on this whole thing. And to have language in this settlement that basically says you have to do it our way or we're not going to stand by anything at all on the whole thing, I agree with Commissioner Fielder. It's like a rock in the hard place type of thing. I do not enjoy being placed in that position right there. It was also said that by Commissioner Bukacek, this is just about an $8. And I understand that, and I can certainly appreciate it. And I'm really happy. I'm very pleased at her understanding and her acknowledgement that all 5 of the commissioners, and I'm sure all the staff, are also sympathetic to the economy and the demands on it. So $8 is not a lot. However, I feel that it is the responsibility of this commission. And after my 6.5 years have gone here, my views have matured quite a bit, and I'm very comfortable with this now, is to say that it is not our job to decide something that's in the realm of reasonableness, but in order to benefit ratepayers, it's the lowest of the reasonableness. And so I believe very strongly that there are some issues that still need to be discussed. There are several serious questions that I have on the motivation of the parties for this settlement and what they agreed to, and whether or not the agreement was simply in order to reach an agreement rather than being convinced of the facts themselves. So there are serious questions to be raised. And so therefore, if we adopt this stipulation today, we will not have an opportunity to ask those questions. I feel it is the very strong responsibility of this agency to ask all the questions that need to be, whether they're embarrassing to anybody or not, whatever. I believe that our job is to have the lowest reasonable fees to ratepayers that highly respects, as was pointed out, the Hope and Bluefield requirements, and that's fair to the utility, but also fair to ratepayers. And fairness to me means the lowest cost to ratepayers. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote no on this and ask other commissioners to proceed to a hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Additional discussion, Commissioner Pinochi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let's turn the clock back about 6 years ago. I was asked to do a tour of the Sydney power facility before I was a commissioner. I was pretty excited to take part of this tour. I had a legislator who I served with, Scott Staffson, representative from Sydney, set up the tour along with some other individuals that were involved in politics. And they were eager to show me the upgrades that they have done to the plant that were really ahead of other coal-fired plants in the country, meeting the requirements of the filtration system in the stacks well into the future. And
Commissioner Kanochi, can I interrupt to say that I'm having trouble hearing you? Maybe if you came closer to the microphone.
okay, Tony, is this better?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. So the investment to do the upgrades was added to the ratepayer, as they explained to me, which was in the millions of dollars. And they felt that this plant was going to be a clean energy producing coal plant ahead of other coal plants in the country. And they explained that it had one of the best records of dependency, being dependable. The power had only been off maybe 3 times in like 60 years. It was an incredible record. And I may be off on that, but it was a record where it showed that dependability was something this plant took very serious, and it had a fantastic record. I met people that have been there for years. I met the manager. He was very proud of the record and very proud of the upgrades. And Representative Staffson is able to tell me as a little boy that his dad and him would get coal to burn on the farm. And he's my age and, in his 50s now. And then just a few months later, we're told that the plant is at end of life. Well, the question that the ratepayers had is, if we were charged money to do the upgrades, do we get that money back? And how did they say that, we're going to make this investment so we're secure into the future and this plan is up to speed and it has the upgrades done just to close it down? Who speaks for the ratepayer to say, can we get that money returned? These are questions the ratepayer came here and testified about. It'll become more complicated because the Savage coal mine, just a few miles away, is in business to supply the coal to the plant. And the Savage School depends heavily on that income of tax base. And some of the highest paying jobs at the Savage mine are at that coal production facility. So, of course, they want me to go do a tour of the coal facility. And I meet a few individuals that are second generation working at this coal production facility. And they're explaining to me that they have rare earth minerals stashed away in certain areas of the mine. And they take me to these areas where they don't really have to go underground. It's really on the surface, and they just simply have to scrape off a layer of dirt, and then they reclaim the land very well and put it back to better than original, where there's a pivot irrigation and they're farming on it. And so they're reclaiming the land and putting it in better condition than it was. And they're quite proud of that. And they're explaining that if we close down the facility, this is going to be very damaging to Savage, and, you just can't let them do it. Now, as a commissioner, I have to explain, we cannot tell the company what to do. Perhaps we can develop some ideas. So a question came up in a meeting if MDU would consider selling the plant. And in the meeting, they said yes. And a couple of entities came forward to purchase it. And as I understand it, they couldn't come to an agreement. So the county commissioners were frustrated with that and feel that it's not quite fair. We paid for the upgrades. And now if we lose the Savage mine, we could lose Sydney Sugars, which depends on coal. And the coal mine says we cannot keep the mine open just based on Sydney Sugars. So there's a possibility that Sydney Sugars would then close. Millions of dollars of production of sugar beets are in the field. One of the advantages, I believe, Sydney Sugars has as a result of a tour that Sydney Sugars gave me is that curing the sugar beets with coal was cheaper than curing the sugar beets with electricity or natural gas. And this gave them an advantage in the market to where they could be competitive. They showed me large amounts of sugar going to, Frosted Flakes, some brands that I grew up with as a kid. I had no idea that this was supplied in Sydney and that we had this advantage. So the concern was kind of put to rest. If we shut MDU down, Sydney Sugars will continue. There won't be any problems. And of course, that didn't work out. Weren't successful in trying to have someone be able to take the plant over, another company, and continue to run it. And after it closed down, Sydney Sugars closed down. And now you've got a pretty hostile tax base community. They came here and testified and said, we don't mind if the rates would go up if they left the plant open. One of the points of view that were brought up is MDU said if we're able to close the plant, we'll lower the prices and we'll be more competitive. Here we are today asking for a rate increase. After all the worst nightmares they said were going to happen, happened. I just returned from Austin where they tell me we have a shortage of electricity in this country. We're producing electric vehicles at an all-time high. They showed me the new Volvo Semi and a charging station to continuously charge 50 Volvo semis will take more energy than the entire town of Havre. And they're saying we need more production of electricity. And here we shut down a plant that this community and this state were depending on. Maybe it wasn't so bad if we would have opened the gas-fired plant in Montana, maybe in the same community, keeping some of those jobs, but it went out of state. Now, I'm struggling with trying to deal with all of these questions that I've had to experience in the last 6 years. And I understand profit's important, but several individuals testifying say that the profits at MDU, they don't think are that bad. In fact, some said that they're having record profits, and that may not be true, but certainly if you're having record profits, you should consider lowering the price. And if you're having profits that are okay, you should consider leaving the profit margin the same. Are we able to show that the profit margin is down? I understand that that arguably was yes. But I can't vote for this, and I'm not going to. And I wish all of you in the room could have been on the tour at the Savage Coal Mine, the tour at the Savage School, the county commissioner meetings that I've attended in Sydney, the coal fire plant tour I was on 6 years ago where they said all the latest upgrades have been done, so we're secure into the future, that the public paid for through rate increases to do those upgrades. And I had to listen to two companies tell me that they were trying to buy it and they were told no after MDU said they would sell it. And the county commissioners coming to me saying, what can we do? Commissioners, do not tell the power companies how to run their business. But I just have too many questions that I have bad answers for. So I'm going to vote no on this today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinocci. Additional discussion?
Mr. President,
Commissioner Bukacek?
may I indulge you again. Nobody likes to pay more for utilities, including us commissioners, but sometimes it's necessary to increase rates in order to fulfill our goal to keep the lights on, the furnaces warm, and the air conditioners doing their job. The content of the consumer letters is understandable and also reasonable. insofar as they misunderstand the rate case process and the Public Service Commissioner's job. I know of at least 3 reasons that consumers don't understand the process. 1, they base their opinion on information received from Montana newspapers. 2, we at the PSC haven't explained the process adequately to the public, though I think Grant did today. And number 3, and most important reason for misunderstanding, is that the process is extremely complex. I did not begin to understand it until I took a revenue requirement class 2 weeks into my job as Public Service Commissioner this year. I'm very fortunate I was able to take this class from one of our esteemed staff members, a nationally known instructor, before his upcoming retirement. The fact that rate cases are not simple is demonstrated by the fact that there are rate school classes that last days to weeks. PSC staff and commissioners work diligently to, as best as possible, ensure affordable, reliable energy for ratepayers. While it is the PSC's job to hold the utilities' feet to the fire within legal constraints and reasonable parameters, we do not do this alone. When the MCC intervenes in these cases, the law requires the PSC to leave the representation of consumers' interest to the MCC. In this case, MCC has agreed that the settlement strikes an appropriate balance between consumer interests and the utilities' interests. So while we commissioners are not given the constitutional authority to be consumer advocates, it is our job to evaluate whether the MCC, Denbury, and MDU struck a reasonable balance here. Rate of return regulation for natural monopolies like energy utilities has been around since the 1800s. And currently utilizes a specific equation for revenue requirements. Approving or disapproving a rate increase requires sophisticated and thorough analysis of thousands of pages of data. And those pages include graphs and tables. Revenue requirements, again, are based on a formula, an equation that includes for the utility their operating expenses, taxes, and capital costs of assets. Capital costs include depreciation expense, plus the utility is entitled to the recovery of and return on its investments. Considering that energy utility companies provide services needed for basic comforts and even survival for its ratepayers, it should be fairly obvious they be given reasonable opportunity to recover prudently incurred costs. Under rate of return regulation, both prices, which are rates, and profits, which is rate of return, are closely regulated. PSC staff in their analysis is not given the task of determining reasonableness based on whether they agree or disagree with the general philosophy of the utility company. Their task is to assess if the rate increase, as stated in the stipulation as a whole, falls within a range of reasonableness. In other words, answering the question, is the revenue requirement reasonable? The give and take of MDU, MCC, and Denbury that allowed them to come to this agreement is laid bare in the settlement and further broken down by our staff in their detailed explanations as to why they are recommending we accept the settlement. And I'm going to vote yes. You might have guessed. I hope I've been helpful in my attempt to scratch the surface of the complex process that we take very seriously here. To act in the public best interests, a public service commissioner should neither rubber stamp an agreement, nor should they pander to uninformed public pressure. Making a decision in the public interest involves weighing the evidence, which in this case supports approving the settlement. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Commissioner Bugachek. Additional discussion, questions? Benochi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Based on Annie's second bite of the apple, Montana believes, and I've been across the state very intensely, that the more energy we produce puts us in a better position to be competitive. Montana does not produce enough energy to supply Montana. I've seen time and time again when we have to import energy from out of state that we pay a higher price. Montanans believe if we produce more energy than we need, the price will come down. Closing a power plant at a time where we're bringing it in is not something that they believe serves the public's best interest. I do not disagree. I want to see our power companies produce more power, and be an energy exporter. And I believe once we accomplish that, we'll be better served, we'll be more secure. There are real concerns that are brought to our attention when we go to these NARUC conferences, that there could be a time where we need energy and it won't be there to import. Or we'll be competing with California, Oregon, and Seattle, and Montana will not be able to compete. Or will they be able to afford that pricing because you simply make more money in those states and they have much more financial power. Now, the concern that one day we're going to need energy and it won't be there will mean a controlled brownout. Now, we're being told that's a concern. So shutting a plant down isn't something that I can sell to the public's best interest. And they all believe, majority of my district, that we need to produce more energy. And they want base load power that's on all the time, whether it's nuclear or hydro or coal or natural gas. And they weren't excited to see the natural gas facility be built out of the state. That makes them feel less secure in Montana. Montana's construction industry in homes and businesses is at an all-time high in the history of the state. Northwestern, Bob Rowe himself, the CEO, called me and said, we just broke a record for the most amount of natural gas and electricity sold ever in the history of Montana. How could a time where we're breaking records on energy use make people feel that we're serving their best interest when a plant shuts down? I fail to have an answer for that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinochi. Additional discussion? Additional discussion? All right, I have some questions for staff. And then I'll make my remarks in this case. So whichever staff wants to jump in first, feel free to do so. So staff, if the commission today were to approve the MDU settlement that we're presently discussing, MDU would be authorized to collect an overall base revenue requirement increase of 6.1 million for electric service in Montana, correct?
Yes, President Brown, that's correct.
Okay, so keeping that 6.1 million figure in mind, how much of that 6.1 million figure is attributable to property tax tracker or increases?
President Brown, Commissioners, approximately 2 million of that is attributable to it.
So essentially 1/3 of the requested increase will go to paying for property tax increases, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so can the staff elucidate not only the commissioners, but the public on what authority the commission has or doesn't have to approve utilities requests to recoup or recover, if you will, property tax payments made?
Touch on that matter, then hand it over to Lucas for further discussion, but it's Montana statute that the property taxes are passed through to Montana ratepayers, and the property tax base gets updated in rate cases like here today. And as we've seen, property taxes have increased. And so this increase in property taxes was a result of that, and it'll get passed through to ratepayers.
So to confirm what you're saying is the Montana legislature has made a legislative decision, which is certainly within their constitutional purview, to authorize utility companies to pass the costs of property taxes directly on to ratepayers.
Yes, President Brown, that's correct.
And we have very limited authority to disapprove of those increases, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So in theory, what we're really acting on is around a $4 million increase given that we've been handcuffed by the legislature, correct?
Correct.
All right. All right. So of the remaining 4 million, the parties to this matter have done it as part of the stipulation, a revenue requirement that includes 1.2 million of revenue that would be attributable to annual amortization and return related to retired coal plant deferrals, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So as I understand it, the coal plants have been retired at this time, correct?
Yes, President Brown, that's correct.
And the commission doesn't have the authority to order MDU to reopen a coal plant, doesn't they? Close coal plant, does it not?
Correct. We do not.
Okay. So I appreciate my colleagues' concerns about the prudency of those decisions. But then let me ask you this question, and any of you can answer. So when a regulated utility comes to the commission and files a rate case, it's my understanding that under Montana law, this is what's called a MAPA proceeding. Are you familiar with that term? And maybe Mr. Hamilton, you should take this series of questions.
I'd be happy to, Mr. President. Yes, it's a proceeding conducted under the Montana Administrative Procedures Act, or MAPA.
And Mr. Hamilton, it's my understanding that under a MAPA proceeding, we as the commission are basing our decisions based on evidence that is presented to the commission, correct?
That's correct. The commission's decision must be based on record evidence.
All right. So with that in mind, have the parties to the stipulation filed papers or documentation that would otherwise support what has been agreed to as part of the stipulation?
Mr. President and Commissioners, the parties reserve the right in the stipulation to return to their original positions if the commission were to disapprove of the settlement agreement. The parties have agreed, however, for the purposes of the settlement agreement, that the $1.2 million in annual revenue requirement is a reasonable resolution of that issue at this time, preserving several key issues for a later rate case.
Okay. All right. So, colleagues, the purpose of me asking these series of questions is to clarify for the public that a portion of this rate increase, we don't have the power to disapprove. Second thing is that our decisions, as I've tried to make clear multiple times during these commissions hearing, has to be based basically on the record evidence before us. I mean, certainly we have some discretion to determine whether or not something is in the interests of the public. But at the same time, we have obligations under law to ensure that not only are the regulated utilities able to operate in a manner that keeps them viable, or as Commissioner Bukacek stated, keeps the lights on, but also we have an obligation to listen to the constitutionally created office of the Consumer Council, which the drafters of the 1972 Constitution specifically identified the Consumer Council as the ratepayers advocate. So these are the terms that we're working under when we consider this. Now, that being said, I do think Commissioner O'Donnell raises one fair point in terms of what we're tasked with looking at. And I think Commissioner O'Donnell is correct that the one concerning part of this agreement is the 1.2 million that has been requested by MDU for the amortization related to the retired coal plants. And the reason that's concerning is that the stipulation doesn't have a starting balance for how that amortization will occur. It doesn't have a defined time period for the amortization period. And it doesn't define what the carrying costs are for the amortization. Now, if you know anything about accounting, and particularly regulatory accounting, those are all very concerning factors for the commission, because we're being asked to essentially trust MDU as to what the figures are. But, and this is now a question for staff, if we're to approve a settlement agreement, that is not the end, if you will, of the amortization question, correct? Because it's my understanding that at some point MDU is going to have to come back to the commission and basically justify how it treated the retirement of the coal plants. Is that correct, Mr. Hamilton?
Mr. President, that is correct. The utility will have to come back to the commission in order to eventually set a balance for that amortization and amortization period and the carrying costs associated. Those issues are merely reserved for a future case.
And I appreciate it that staff doesn't want to deal in speculation, but it seems to me, because the parties have agreed not to deal with, if you will, the costs related to Heskett 4, that MDU is going to have to come back before this commission at some point if it wants to recover costs associated with Heskett 4, correct?
Mr. President, that is correct.
All right. All right. Let me speak to my motion. Colleagues, I appreciate the great conversation today. I have allowed a little leeway, if you will, to allow commissioners to make multiple comments on this matter, because this is a matter of great consequence to the state of Montana and to the constituencies of several of my colleagues, and certainly to the ratepayers of MDU. And so I think this matter deserves fair and full discussion. And I appreciate the civility that my colleagues have shown in discussing this matter. As you can imagine, since I made the motion to adopt the settlement proposal filed in this matter, I will be supporting it. I agree with comments made by all my colleagues today that there isn't a member of this commission who does not take seriously any proposal that may result in a rate increase for consumers, as this proposal does. But as stated, our responsibility as PSC commissioners is to ensure that rates are just and reasonable. And such responsibility is particularly solemn at a time such as now, when cost of living is increasing for Montanans across the Treasurer State and inflation rates are running high. As we heard during the listening sessions held on MDU's application, circumstances are clearly putting a strain on hardworking Montana families. And it's important to keep that in mind. But it's also important for the public to understand that our job at the PSC is to balance the interests of ratepayers with the public need to ensure that utilities that provide services are in a financial position to continue doing so. I think the events of Texas in 2001 inform us in the importance of having utilities that are able to meet demand at times when demand is most in need. The law requires that we as the PSC do not approve rates that are unjustly too high, or, as the public may not realize, are unjustly too low. I believe this is the circumstance we find ourselves in now, where rejecting the settlement may result in long-term challenges for MDU to continue to provide safe and reliable services to its Montana customers. As already noted by staff, MDU's originally filed application in this matter requested an annual electric revenue increase of roughly $10.45 million, requested a return on equity of 10.5%, and an overall rate of return of roughly 7.52%. Company, in support of its application, provided documentation in support of these figures, citing among the factors necessitating a rate increase as the following: rising property taxes, as we discussed, additional investments made by the company in infrastructure needed to adequately serve its customers now and into the future, and increased operating and maintenance expenditures in this era of rising costs, which all of us are very familiar with. And as my colleagues know, and as we've discussed, the Montana Consumer Council intervened in this matter on behalf of MDU's ratepayers. Earlier this year, after the parties to this matter engaged in lengthy discovery, the commission was presented with a mutually agreed upon settlement, a settlement that has been signed off by all three parties to the existing document. And what numbers do we have before us for decision? Stipulated settlement revenue requirement is some 4 million below the original request, as we discussed. The ROE is stipulated 9.65, which is down from the originally requested 10.5%. And if you read through the stipulation filing, you'll pretty much see that all aspects of the application as originally filed have been reduced in favor of the ratepayer as a result of the settlement before us. That's just a fact. Turning now to the specifics of the stipulated revenue requirement of 61.1 million, as staff answered. And as the public needs to be aware of that, 6.1 million, 2 million is directly attributable to Montana property tax increases. To state that another way, 1/3 of the rate increase, if approved, is to pay for property taxes. Increased property taxes, I'll bet that sounds familiar to all those that are listening and watching this afternoon. To this end, the public needs to be aware that the Montana legislature has enacted legislation that prohibits the commission from disapproving rate increases used to cover Montana property taxes so long as those property tax payments were reasonably incurred. So my admonition to those listening, if you have a problem with how the property tax structure is in the state of Montana, that's a legislative issue. As to the remaining 4 million, as you heard from PSC staff, the commission uses several well-established regulatory mechanisms for determining whether a rate increase is reasonable and just. And as explained by staff, the numbers contained in the settlement are well documented and are within a range deemed reasonable by staff analysis, with the high end of reasonableness sitting at roughly 9.3 million, with an ROE of 10.10%, considering current market conditions and the comparable rate of standards established by the Supreme Court cases that were mentioned earlier. Further, should the settlement be adopted, MDU's customers will see no increases in the basic service charges for residential, small general service, irrigation, and space heating. In turn, large general service, municipal pumping, and contract service customers do see an increase in the basic service charge. Therefore, in my opinion, any concern the commission may have about rate shock for residential customers is mitigated to the best that we can do. I do recognize the concerns of Commissioner Pinocci as to the impact that MDU's business decisions have made on residents of Sydney and those folks living across the eastern state, part of the state. I'm certainly aware that the devastation of the economy to Sydney by the closure of Sydney Sugars, but again, we're not a policy making body in these rate making cases. Our job is to ensure what has been brought before us is supported by record evidence. Again, I'm not thrilled with how the settlement treats the amortization and return related to the retired coal plants. I must confess that that issue alone made it difficult for me to support this settlement, but I believe it is in the best interests of both MDU and MDU's customers to approve this settlement. Further, given the fact that the ratepayers advocate MCC has signed off on the settlement and requested that the commission approve it on behalf of MDU's customers, I do agree with staff's recommendation that the stipulation provides MDU with a reasonable opportunity to recover its prudently incurred costs. It's not an outcome that any of us would hope, to have rate increases come at a time when families are suffering from increased costs everywhere else in their lives. But this is the situation before us, and the evidence points to adopting and supporting the settlement agreement, and I will do so. Thank you, colleagues. Additional discussion?
Mr. President.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. Thank you for your statements. Excellent analysis. I really do appreciate, in particular, bringing out for the listening public that there are many factors that the utility has to pay and the ratepayers need to bear that are imposed by legislative, by state or federal, and mandates or agencies or court decisions. That's very, very important to point out. A couple of things. One is that, as you mentioned, that we need to make a decision based on the record. And this is what I wanted to make in my earlier points. We should be basing our decision on the record, not on the stipulation. The original proposal by MCC of $3.5 million. This part of the questions that I had would like to go for this for hearing is to say certainly the stipulation provides for all of the necessities of the fair rate of return, whatever, for the utility. But would MCC's original position also satisfy those requirements? And I haven't seen an analysis of that, and I would very much like to see that. The other thing is, if I understood you correctly, to say that if we reject this today, it might impose significant harm on MDU. I certainly get that, but I wanted to clarify that the vote on the stipulation is not a vote on the rate case. What I'm asking for is more discussion of this to clear up several different matters so that we can reach a more informed decision. And that is the summation of my points. But thank you again, Mr. President. Excellent condensation and explanation of all of the different matters in this. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Bukuchik.
I just wanted to echo what Commissioner O'Donnell just said about the education piece you just provided, Mr. President.
Additional discussion? Additional discussion? All right, let's go to vote on this. Seeing no additional discussion, we'll do a roll call vote on this. All right, Vice President Fielder,
Aye.
Commissioner Pinocci,
No.
Commissioner O'Donnell,
No.
Commissioner Bukuchik,
Aye.
and I am an aye. So my motion passes 3-2. Settlement agreement is adopted. Before we move off, I'd just like to thank our excellent staff for your great work in doing analysis on not only the original application that was filed, but also on the settlement agreement that was filed. Your commentary and work was well received by the commissioners and very informative, I think, not only for us, but for the public. So thank you. And for all you do. We have a great staff at the PSC, need to be recognized. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues for the civil discussion on this matter. It was not an easy docket to take up and to vote upon. So thank you for the courtesy that you showed to each other. All right. Public announcement for those who generally watch our commission proceedings. The good news for the consuming public is that our next commission and business meeting, which was scheduled for Tuesday, August 15, 2023, has been canceled. So our next commission business meeting will be for Tuesday, August 22nd, 2023. So no commission meeting this week. Also, just for public information, starting next week, the commission will hold 5 town hall meetings across the state regarding Northwest Energy's IRP. Those will be held, one meeting will be held in each of the commission districts. So we strongly encourage the public to attend one of our meetings and to provide input and analysis and comment on Northwest Energy's IRP. The dates and times and locations will be published on our next official calendar. Seeing no further business to come before us, the time is now 2:35 p.m. I will adjourn today's business meeting.